Hello and welcome to U.S. History since 1877, HIST 141. This is Derek Taylor, and my lecture on America in the Second World War, 1931 to 1945. America gets into the second round of World War, which more or less is a continuation of the first. So let's jump right in. As I mentioned, I just said the Second World War is a continuation of the first in many ways. Many of the same issues are involved: nationalism, imperial ambitions, and so on and so forth. The instability of the world, the Great Depression leads to the rise of autocratic governments, which fascist dictatorships, which will turn toward military solutions to their country's problems. FDR watched all of this in the 1930s with a lot of concern, but he had problems at home dealing with the Depression, the New Deal, and this only strengthened the country's isolationist tendencies. He limited his foreign policy to very uncontroversial things. And at the same time, he was hemmed in by Congress. Congress in the 1930s passed a series of neutrality acts that blocked the president from any meaningful response to some things going on in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So you have these things sort of playing into the rise of these dictatorships in the 1930s, and there were many. By 1938, of 27 European nations at the time, only 10 still had systems of democratic self-government. And 16 dictatorships, and then the Soviet Union along with them. Many of these nations rested their governments on personal and military power. In places like smaller countries like Poland, Hungary, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. And across the spectrum, you had several models for this turning away from democracy. The most prominent one being fascism, because of Germany, because of the Nazis, and because of Italy, who were both technically fascist. And by the way, just to clear up some confusion here, to give you a precise definition of fascism, because given our public discourse these days, everybody basically can be considered a fascist according to their opponents. Fascism, my understanding, has 5 characteristics. One is that it is nationalistic. Again, most nationalists are not fascists. Some people confuse them, but all fascists are nationalists, let's put it that way. Particularly embracing a sort of populist or organic form of the nation. Secondly, fascism is statist, both in its organization and its goals. It seeks to build up the state and to use the state to impose a singular vision, a singular will on the population. Thirdly, fascist ideas are transcendent, meaning that they are meant to transcend political, class, ethnic status divisions. The nation is supposed to be everything. And the fourth characteristic follows from this. Fascist ideologies tend to be cleansing, as in political and ethnic cleansing. Why? To get rid of the divisions. And then finally, fifthly, all fascist ideologies are militaristic or paramilitaristic, both in terms of organization, but also in terms of beliefs. Fascist governments believe in warfare as a means of advancing the nation's interests. Now, some of these types of governments were not as doctrinaire as the Nazis were. The other model, of course, of this being the Soviets, the communist state. I won't delve into that too much. There were a couple of exceptions on these dictators. One is Francisco Franco in Spain, who's the dictator who takes power after 1939. And then Antonio Salazar in Portugal. And the idea that the form of government that they had in Portugal, sometimes called corporatism, and it just refers to basically the idea that a system in which employers, workers, and state officials manage the economy together as a sort of state within a state. Antonio Salazar, the more or less strongman of Portugal for many decades, was actually an economics professor before he became a leader of the state. And again, this is partly to manage the economy as a whole. It's also meant to overcome class conflict by incorporating everybody into the state. In practice, however, it was meant used in a lot of other places to, reduce the opposition, as it was in Italy. Italy was also a corporatist state, technically a fascist state, but they were never quite as doctrinaire or as violent as the Nazis were. And so it is in the 1930s that the most powerful and destructive of these dictatorships comes to power, are the Nazis. And their leader, Adolf Hitler, was born of German parents in Vienna in 1889. He was a frustrated artist who dropped out of school, couldn't get into art school, so went to Vienna. Didn't like Vienna because it was multicultural, multi-ethnic, had a lot of liberals there. Didn't like liberals, didn't like Marxists. And but he served in the army in World War I, and he found this experience to be exhilarating. And he was crushed by Germany's defeat in World War I. Indeed, he blamed scapegoats like Bolsheviks, Jews, and other people for the loss. Following the war, he came back with the military, and he was instructed by his unit, which was an army political instruction unit, to join a small party called the National Socialists. They were a socialist party. Again, presumably to spy on them and see what their activities were up to. Instead, Hitler used this occasion to take over the party and turn it into his own personal platform. He created a force within the party called the Brown Shirts, or the Stormtroopers, paramilitary group, and used them to lead a putsch, an attempted coup d'etat in Munich in 1923 during the Ruhr crisis, when France invaded the country over reparations. And he was jailed with a failure. But when he went to trial, he turned his trial into a publicity circus, made himself famous. He was convicted and sentenced to several years in prison, in which he wrote his book, Mein Kampf, where he laid out his vision for basically Germany taking over parts of Eastern Europe and uniting all the Germanic peoples that lived in those states into one state. I'll come back to this in a moment. This is very much connected with Nazi aggression. What happened after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, which he saw as a betrayal of the country, is that you had parts of German territory carved up, but you also had states created, states like Poland and Czechoslovakia, which, as you'll see in a moment, are the first two states that the Nazis invade, who have large ethnic German populations, and they will use that as a justification of the invasion. But he lays all this out in Mein Kampf. He basically says he's just going to do that, wants to do that, also blames Jews and talks about basically cleansing the country of Jews in Mein Kampf. When he gets out of prison, because he's in prison, but also because of the stability of Germany during the height of the Weimar years, the Nazis have very little success at the polls. In 1928, for example, in elections for the Reichstag, which is the parliamentary body of the German Republic, the Nazis only won 800,000 votes and 12 seats in 1928. So before the Great Depression, that's what begins this, is the Great Depression, they begin to rise. 2 years later, they get 6.5 million votes, and they claim 105 seats in the Reichstag. By 1932, they gained 13 million votes and 230 seats in the Reichstag. At the same time, what had been an officially socialist party has become one more in tune with the capitalist class, the industrialist class, which despises Hitler, by the way, but sees him as a useful tool. Most of the people, a lot of people actually in politics despise him. The aristocracy, really, is what's left of the aristocracy in Germany, despises him. He despises them too. And competing politicians sort of saw Hitler as their tool as well. And it's by their manipulations that he'll eventually be made chancellor of the country in 1933. Once in office, he begins appointing his henchmen to key positions in the Prussian state police, and then uses the incident of the Reichstag fire to denounce Bolshevism and suspend freedom of speech and press, eventually holding elections where they'll get enough of a majority, will the Nazis and their social nationalist allies, to vote him full emergency powers because of the Reichstag fire, and essentially begins ruling as a dictator. from 1933 onward. At the same time, the Western democracies, the democracies in Western Europe basically failed to do anything to stop him. Britain and France are preoccupied by economic problems in the 1930s. Their governments, especially in France, are kind of fragile to a certain degree. There's a lot of divisions in France. Government leaders that come to power as prime ministers in Britain, like Neville Chamberlain, are very efficient administrators, but they're not really up to the task of dealing with a person like Hitler. At the same time, Japan in 1931 will invade Manchuria. They invade the province of Manchuria using the pretext of an explosion along a Japanese-controlled railway in Manchuria to attack the Chinese. And this will sort of set off, again, a war that will go on for several decades, obviously. But so you already have that stuff going on there. At the same time, Germany begins to rearm after 1933, again, in violation of the Versailles Treaty. 1935, Hitler declares it openly. We're not going to be bound by the provisions of the treaty. They begin conscription, building up this air force. France and Britain protest. They don't really do anything. A year later, in 1936, Hitler will march his troops into the Rhineland area, which is a huge violation of the Versailles Treaty. Remember, Rhineland is the western border with France. They had invaded France in World War I. That's why it was supposed to be demilitarized. And he marched his troops into it as a provocation. France and Britain did nothing. And the reasons for this are very interesting and very complicated. Hitler's generals warned him that if they started a fight, they couldn't win it with the French at that point. Their rearmament their buildup hadn't gotten underway enough. And in fact, he only sent 22,000 troops into the Rhineland and gave them orders that if they saw the French coming, to turn back around. The French had nearly 3 times as many troops staying at the border. So why didn't the French act? Several reasons. One is they overestimated the size of the force that Hitler sent there in the beginning. Second reason is they didn't want to act without British support, and the British refused to do anything. But even maybe bigger than all these three is the last reason, is that French public opinion was deeply opposed to any military action. You have to remember France especially. You can blame the Allies for being slow in the draw and all this. France suffered more than any other country in World War I, and they were just sick of it and didn't want a repeat of it. And this is what allowed Hitler and then Italy to undertake aggressive actions without being confronted. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Why? Well, first of all, Italy, before it was back in 1896, actually, had tried to invade it once, and Ethiopia defeated them. This was seen as a black mark by nationalists like Mussolini. They wanted to have an empire. Italy hadn't had an empire before. And so they invaded in 1935. The League of Nations condemned this, but the British and the French don't do anything to back it up. And so in 1936, Italy has captured Ethiopia. This effectively means the death of the League of Nations. And in 1937, Mussolini signs a treaty with Hitler, the Berlin Pact. At the same time, you have a violent, bloody civil war breaking out in 1936 in Spain. Spain's monarchy collapses in 1931. A republic is proclaimed after a couple of years of tutelage under a left-of-center government, which enacts a bunch of social reforms. They have their first regular elections in 1933, which promptly returns a very conservative body, which undoes all those reforms. A few years later, in 1936, a Spanish version, a Spanish Popular Front is elected. Popular Front means an alliance of socialist and communist parties, which again reenacts a bunch of social reforms, most of which are popular, but the more extreme elements of this Popular Front begin confiscating land, again trying to redistribute the wealth, fomenting general strikes, but more seriously, and this is what sets off the Civil War really, is they begin to attack the Catholic Church in Spain. They go around destroying churches, occasionally attacking, murdering priests. This eventually will lead to a revolt within the military stationed in Morocco. They have a base there due to the Spanish, and this leads to a civil war. After a year of fighting, the two sides stalemated, and then foreign powers intervene. The fascist powers on behalf of the military and Francisco Franco, their leader, that would be Hitler and Mussolini, and then the Soviet Union on the side of the Republicans, the anti-clerical Republicans. But the Soviet Union doesn't provide enough aid, partly because it's expecting other allies to sort of go with them, Western countries. When they fail to do this, Stalin changes his mind, withdraws support from the Republicans in 1938, and within a year that turns the tide, and Francisco Franco defeats them in 1939. And one of the things that's important about the Spanish Civil War for World War II is that it was a dry run in some ways for Germany. They famously wanted to try out their air force, the Luftwaffe, which they famously sent to do strafing, which they did. They killed civilians, in other words. If you know the famous painting by Pablo Picasso called Guernica, which was about the Luftwaffe's attack on that town in Spain, dates to this. So it's a dry run for their military buildup. And then they also begin making his intentions known, enacting the ideas that were Mein Kampf in 1938. In 1938, Hitler orders his troops to march into Austria. There were Nazi sympathizers within the Austrian government. And again, this was part of his idea of taking territory. Basically, took them without firing a shot. And this is called the Anschluss of 1938. Again, this is a violation of the Versailles Treaty. Britain and France protested, but they also told the Chancellor of Austria they wouldn't do anything if Germany invaded. He also began the next year to use the threat of force to take parts of Czechoslovakia. In particular, there was a corner of Czechoslovakia, a country had been created after World War I by the Allied powers, called the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland, more than 3/4 of its population were ethnic Germans. It also contained key industries, among other things. Sudetenland, Germans in the Sudetenland, encouraged by the Nazis, began to denounce the Czech government, while Hitler and his propaganda ministers began accusing the Czech government of crimes against Germans and warned of retribution for them. And at one point, he was planning an invasion. Well, at this point, 1938, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, steps in. He decides to intervene, and Hitler agrees to a conference with him. And basically, they think that Hitler will stop once he gets to Sudetenland. That's his goal. Neville Chamberlain was a very decent man. He was a good administrator. He wanted to keep Britain out of another war. And so they basically signed away the Sudetenland in 1938. It basically just did nothing. Next year, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and annexed it, made it a protectorate. He next turned to Poland. Poland had a city in his territory called Danzig, which had been a German city before World War I. It was given to them by the Allies after World War I. He basically demanded Poles turn over Danzig to them. Danzig was very important to the economy of the Poles. They refused. And as a result, there had been some negotiation between the Soviets, the British, and the French, but it broke down over promises of over Soviet demands for military bases in Poland. And instead, in August of 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets signed a pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, where they basically agreed to carve up Poland between them. And this is the green light. Basically, 8 weeks or so later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Within less than a month, less than 4 weeks, they have taken the country completely. Britain and France declare war on Germany. And the next year, same year later, September 27th, 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, making them the Axis powers in this scheme to get empires. Thus begins the Second World War, at least in Europe, I should say, because there had already been an invasion of Manchuria in 1931, as I mentioned before, by the Japanese, and they had broken out into full-scale conflict in 1937 themselves. So you already have war beginning earlier in Asia. You can see the picture of Hitler leaving his troops, the German victory parade into Poland in 1939. So it's a world war by 1939 in Asia and in Europe. So how does America get into this? I mentioned before, you had a serious anti-interventionist mentality in the 1930s. Partly this was disillusionment with American participation in World War I, partly because you had people who were upset about war profiteers who had managed to come out of the World War I for financial gain, which is true, by the way. A lot of big companies profited off of World War I, even if some of these charges weren't very accurate. Again, led to the passage of the first Neutrality Act in 1935, which imposed an embargo on trading arms with countries at war and declared that American citizens traveled on ships of belligerent nations at their own risk. A second one, 1936, expanded to ban loans to belligerents. And 1937 adopted a cash and carry provision, basically. So you had these acts that fairly restricted, especially the president's ability to act. And FDR stuck to this. He won re-election on a platform of neutrality in 1940. Despite all this, his sympathies were clearly with the Allies. In March of 1941, he got Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act to, quote, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of, unquote, arms and equipment to any country whose defense was considered vital to the present security of the United States. This would also be extended later on to the Soviet Union after it became part of the Allied coalition. And this effectively marks the beginning of U.S. involvement, even before it gets in militarily speaking. In 1941, you also have the United States and Britain signing an Atlantic Charter calling for economic collaboration between the two countries and for guarantees of political stability at the end of the war, free trade, national self-determination, collective security, so on and so forth. They make themselves allies. And so, and things, by the way, were getting pretty serious. By 1941, Nazi submarines and American vessels were fighting in the Atlantic, unknown to the American public already. But Roosevelt wasn't gonna, without an enemy attack, he really couldn't call for war. And that situations we didn't. Until, of course, the attack came. As I mentioned before, Japanese, they attacked this. First of all, they got into a clash with the Chinese in 1937, which started full-scale war. If you're wondering why it only broke out in 1937, not 1931 in China, the reason why is because you had a civil war going on between communists and nationalist leadership. Chairman Mao Zedong for the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek of the nationalists. But by 1937, they basically made a formal alliance to sort of repel the Japanese. And so the Japanese in 1937 brutally attacked the city of Nanking. This is, you'll see sources about this from your Major Problems reader, which again, the attacks are brutal, the attacks on civilians, the so-called rape of Nanking, because that was one of the things that happened, large-scale assaults on women. In response, the United States, again, did not intervene militarily speaking. They didn't want to go to war without a pretext. And but instead, when they basically protested, and a few years later, Japan occupied part of French territory in what is today Vietnam. When they did this, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the U.S. and put an embargo on trade with Japan, including all oil shipments, which was really important because Japan didn't have any oil. They got most of it from the United States. In fact, these sanctions were really crippling. And at some point, the United States understood Japan was planning an attack. They didn't know when or where it would occur. It occurred, of course, on December 7th, 1941. Japanese bombers attacked the naval installation at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And within a few days, other American posts in the Pacific fell to the Japanese, including the Philippines. The next day, December 8th, Congress voted to declare war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the US, and the United States in turn declared war on them, thus marking our United States entry into the Second World War. This is a picture of Pearl Harbor from the day of December 7th, 1941. If you've ever been to, get a chance to go to the memorial there, the Arizona Memorial, it's quite moving. Been there myself from 1941 at Pearl Harbor, still there to this day. Here's just an outline of, again, I mentioned that sort of you had conflicts, excuse me, between Allied and Axis powers sort of happening in the North Atlantic, even before the United States formally got into the war. You can kind of see why. It was a big war, not just on land, of course, was at sea. A lot of it was at sea, actually, for a lot of different reasons. And so America mobilizes for war. And one of the things that happens, one of the major things that come out of this, is the expansion of government during the war's response to all this. 11 days after Pearl Harbor, Congress passes the War Powers Act in 1941. This gave FDR unprecedented authority over all aspects of the war. And this is a turning point, because as historians point later out, this gives FDR kind of extra constitutional authority to wage conflicts. In other words, executives, presidents later in the century are going to use this to fight wars without getting congressional approval for it. So it's the beginning of that process. A lot of things begin actually as a result of World War II, excuse me, and then the Cold War. The other thing, of course, is that defense mobilization effectively ended the Great Depression. Between 1940 and 1945, the gross national product doubled, after-tax profits of American businesses doubled, farm output grew by 1/3. The Revenue Act of 1942 expanded the number of people paying income taxes from 3.9 million to 42.6 million. Taxes on personal income and business profits paid for half the cost of the war. The number of civilians employed by the government increased almost fourfold. Leadership of federal agencies was turned over to volunteer business executives, such as Henry Kaiser, the Kaiser Foundation. Many wartime agencies extended the power of the federal government. The War Production Board awarded defense contracts, evaluated military and civilian requests for resources, yada, yada, yada. It led to the creation of the beginnings of what later Dwight D. Eisenhower will call the military-industrial complex. The War Powers Board preferred to work with major corporations. These were very large businesses that will later on form the core of that sort of complex in the post-war years. But it helps America turn out thousands and thousands and millions of guns and tanks and airplanes and everything else they need to fight the war. As far as the actual fighting force itself, it took some time to mobilize the military. This is the last time this happens, but if you recall, as I mentioned earlier, the United States didn't have a big army in peacetime before the Cold War. Quite frankly, they weren't really ready for it. Just to give you a couple of examples, my grandfather was on a destroyer in World War II, and he told me that first time he and his crew went out to sea, they were guarding merchant ships going back and forth from Britain, and this is his first time out at sea, and basically the rest of his crew was the first time they went out. Well, they're all scared to death, and so the first time they saw a couple of planes, they opened fire on these planes, shot at them. They buzzed away, flew away. When they made port finally in England, in Southampton, their captain called them on board, called all the crew on board the deck. And when they got up on the deck, there were two British pilots, RAF pilots, Royal Air Force pilots, and it was their planes they had been shooting at earlier. So one of the pilots holds up a picture of a British Spitfire plane and says to them, "Look here, mates. You see these planes? Don't shoot at these planes. We're your allies." Excuse me. Oh, thrown back here again, thrown forward. And you have stories besides something like that, of so-called 40-day wonders. 40-day wonders were ship captains. They didn't have enough captains to man all the ships they needed to put out. So they trained these naval captains for 40 days and then put them out at sea. A lot of them were way over their heads. So again, it gives you an idea of just how not a great power the United States was, even at this point. Eventually, by the end of the war, it will be, of course, and the armed forces of the United States will number 15 million people. One of the things to mention about this Grande Armée is at this time it does actually have African Americans fighting in the war. Some of them famously become pilots, the so-called Tuskegee Airmen. A lot of them still assigned menial jobs. Nearly 1 million African Americans will serve. Mexican Americans and Native Americans were never segregated the same way, however, as African Americans were. And of course, some of the most important of these soldiers were Native American code talkers, Navajo code talkers, whose codes were never broken by the Axis powers. So it's sort of a grand coalition of lots of different peoples, but again, still that tension there, socially speaking, during the war. And you also have, workers involved in the war effort, government and corporate recruiters sought to remedy the war-induced labor shortage by drawing on women in the workforce. Women made up 36% of the labor force in 1945, with compared 24% at the beginning of the war. Women's participation in the workforce would dip again after the war, but it would start going back up in the late 1940s. At the same time, organized labor responded to the war with an outburst of patriotic unity. On December 23rd, 1941, representatives of the major unions made a non-binding no-strike pledge for the duration of the war. As you're going to see, African Americans didn't make that same pledge, and we'll come back to this in a second. But unions thrived during the wartime. Union membership expanded. Roosevelt set up the National War Labor Board, which established wages, hours, and working conditions. He had the authority to seize plants that did not comply. Dissatisfaction would peak in 1943, in which there was a national railroad strike, which was narrowly averted. And this eventually led to a reaction. Congress passed an anti-union labor act over Roosevelt's vetoes. And so strikes were prohibited in defense industry as a result. Kind of a mixed bag. However, one group did actually demonstrate and get something from the government. That was African Americans. Even before the war started in 1941, A. Philip Randolph of the Porters Union, train car porters, threatened to have a 100,000-man march on Washington if FDR and Washington didn't get government contractors to hire more Black workers. Majority of the workers, for example, in the aircraft industry were actually African Americans. They wanted better wages, stuff like this. Not wanting to have anything be disturbed, FDR actually signed into law the Order 88802 in 1941, which effectively basically called for prohibiting discrimination in the employment of defense industries because of race and other things. This did give increase to a certain degree. It committed the federal government to hiring African Americans. Its impact was limited at the time to a certain degree. It got Randolph to call up the strike, but it'll be used as a precedent later on during the civil rights movement to force contractors to hire people of different races this way. So another expansion of the government's role there. FDR called for a second Bill of Rights in 1944 in his State of the Union address. It largely to give Americans access to things like healthcare and stuff like this. Didn't go very far, but whoops, what is doing this? But it did lead to the passage of the GI Bill in 1944, excuse me, which provided education, job training, medical care, pensions, and mortgage loans for those who served during the war. Lots of people would go to college on the GI Bill after the war because of this. But after already having served 3 terms, which is nobody else has ever served more than 2, his last election was his closest for Roosevelt. He only received 53% of the vote, and so it was probably a near-run thing. Probably the people were getting antsy about him being in power so long. Remember, there were people in the 1930s thought he was a dictator. This is actually will lead to eventually, after his death, the passage of an amendment of the Constitution, term limiting presidents. Before then, you could have had it, but that's what led to that, was fears about people staying in power too long. You just have some images of women workers during the war. Again, real life Rosie the Riveters from the textbook. And here is just a nice illustration of how the war got the United States out of the Depression. And you can see just how much it does. I mean, you can see how much ramping up that war production. It makes America, well, this will get us in a second, it makes for a pretty happy populace during the war. Hey, they're not getting killed by stuff like this, but people are pretty happy during the war. Partly because there's an Office of War Information to disseminate information, propaganda, and pro-patriotism. The OWI, as we'll call it here, urged advertising agencies to link their clients to products to the war effort. Pop culture definitely reflected this American idea, especially Hollywood churned out a bunch of, supportive movies supportive of the war during the war itself. People on the home front contributed spontaneously. They formed civilian defense committees, collected old newspapers, scrap material, served on rationing and draft boards, planted victory gardens that produced 40% of the nation's vegetables during the war. But the biggest thing was people were happy because war brought prosperity for the United States. Federal defense spending meant people were getting paid more. Take-home pay, despite wage freezes, was higher than any point since the 1920s. The only major inconveniences of the war were limitations placed on consumption, rationing, on everything, clothing, food. All this was subjected to rationing by the Office of Price Administration. At the same time, you're going to have massive migration during the war itself, which is going to reshape the country in a lot of ways. It affected where people lived. Families would follow service members to training bases or points of debarkation, as well as following the lure of high-paying defense jobs. California, for example, which was the center of a lot of, going to the Asian theater, going from there to fight the Japanese. It was affected by wartime migration than any other state. It experienced a 53% growth in population during World War II, more than doubled. Somewhere during the war, somewhere between 1 in 5, 1 in 8 Americans moved to a different state to find work. That's an amazing number, by the way. I read a statistic a few years ago, just to give you an idea. This is in the 2010s. I think it was in Atlantic Monthly, that only 3% of the US population at that point had moved to a different state for work. During the war, it was as high as 25%. That's amazing, all because of the war. Moreover, our modern interstate highway system was built largely to move troops from coast to coast. It's of course also to the war we owe the building of Las Vegas as a building of a stopover destination for soldiers on their way to the West Coast. More than 1 million African Americans migrated to defense centers in California, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, which led to, of course, racial conflicts over jobs and housing, as it did during World War I. So you have a lot of just a chain reaction of things. Again, that's have a big effect in the post-war era. And here you can see a picture of African Americans demanding, jobs, pay raises, stuff like this during the war. And a couple of wartime rationing propaganda posters. On the left-hand side, you have one trying to shame people into not buying stuff. And then on the right, you have people trying to shame people not to travel too much. Don't waste fuel needed for the war effort. One last thing that happens, and again, this is also unfortunately part of a forced migration, is the internment of Japanese citizens during the war. Despite some racial tension, the home front was generally calm in the 1940s. German and Italian Americans didn't really experience any prejudice as they had during World War I. And even the American communists were left alone, especially after the Soviet Union became an ally in 1940 in the war. So why did the Japanese not get exempt from this? Well, partly, of course, it's moral panic due to, of course, they were attacked by the Japanese. So it's more direct, but it's also because, potentially Japan could be attacked. California could be attacked. And 1942, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the War Department the authority to evacuate Japanese Americans from the West Coast and to intern them in relocation camps for the rest of the war. Despite really no real evidence of any disloyalty or anything else. And almost nobody opposed the plan. It pretty much went unopposed. The War Relocation Authority moved 112,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were citizens, and sent them to internment camps not only in California, but Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Arkansas. The only place that was untouched by this, by the way, was Hawaii. The reason being that the island of Hawaii had a population that was 1/3 Japanese, and the island simply couldn't function without them there. So it wasn't touched. They weren't touched. You could get out of this. Furloughs for seasonal workers attending college, enlistment in the armed services were routes out of the camps. One of them, go back here for a second. Oh boy, let me get this. Not done. Yes, one person did challenge this. A man named Gordon Hirabayashi was a Japanese American, was a student at the University of Washington and a religious pacifist. He registered with his draft board as a conscientious objector. He challenged internment by refusing to register evacuation. And instead, he went and interned himself into the FBI. He was tried and convicted. He appealed his case to the Supreme Court. And in 1943, in Hirabayashi versus the United States, in a later case, the court allowed the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast on the basis of military necessity, quote unquote, but avoided ruling on the constitutionality of the internment program at all. Congress eventually issued an apology in 1988 and awarded $20,000 each to $20,000 to each of the 80,000 surviving Japanese American internees who were still alive at that point. So a real black mark on the United States government and FDR's record. And you can see again where the location camps were, where the populations were. Again, so anyway, you can kind of see where it was, mostly in the West. Don't ask me whether it sent them to Oklahoma. I don't know, but that's one of the reasons there. And you have just an image of the camps, a few Japanese American kids behind the barbed wire. So when they got into the war, again, part of the war with the signing of the Atlantic Charter meant that the United States and Great Britain were all in on a sort of vision of a post-war order as being democratic, as being for free trade, as being capitalist. And so they were simpatico with this. However, once the Soviet Union got into all this, Stalin had not been part of that agreement. He was a little bit suspicious about this, especially because the Russians, once they got into the war in 1943, Hitler invaded in 1943, or was it 1942? Excuse me. It turned on them. They wanted a second front opened in Western Europe, preferably in France, to draw German troops away from Russian soil. The Russians bore the brunt of the war in Europe. They suffered greatly as a result of the German invasion. And Roosevelt and Churchill agreed in 1943 to do this in a promise for Stalin's promise to fight against Japan once the war in Europe ended. However, it was delayed by a year. And again, this meant that the Soviets bore the brunt of the land battle against Germany. And this led to a lot of distrust. Stalin suspected that the West was delaying on purpose to bleed the Soviet Union dry. This will carry over into the Cold War later on. And initially, of course, the war in Europe was a disaster for the Allies. They suffered several defeats on land and sea, both in Europe and Asia. In 1939, the British had to evacuate their army from Dunkirk. You've seen the fine film by Christopher Nolan. They had to leave a bunch of personnel and equipment behind. The French were defeated very quickly in 1940 and occupied by the Nazis, who set up a puppet government at Vichy in France, run by Marshal Pétain, who was a hero of the First World War. Nazis then occupied or sent troops into large parts of Scandinavia and North Africa as well, up until 1942. The first time the Americans faced the Nazis in North Africa, they were wiped out. Again, very poor. Very poor. Again, the British didn't think much of us once we got into it. We weren't ready for it, which we weren't. But within a year, under the leadership of Dwight Eisenhower, Bernard Law Montgomery from the British, George Patton from the Americans, they managed to push Germany's Afrika Korps out of North Africa. And the next year, they began to move to attack the Axis powers through Italy. In 1943, Mussolini's fascist regime was overthrown, and the new government joined the Allies. However, the country was occupied by the Nazis. So they began a brutal year-long campaign, actually 2-year-long campaign, first into Sicily, then up to the spine of Italy, finally entering Rome in June of 1944, but not really. Last German forces didn't surrender until May of 1945. So long, brutal campaigns. And at the same time, the turning point of the war really comes in Europe, comes in Russia, in Stalingrad in 1944. Massive siege, one of the most brutal battles in history of mankind, I guess. But it halted the German advance into the Soviet Union. By 1944, Stalin's forces had driven Germans out of the Soviet Union. The invasion of France finally came, of course, on June 6, 1944, under General Eisenhower's command, when 1.5 million American, British, Canadian troops crossed the Channel. By 1944, they liberated Paris. By September, they had driven Germans out of most of France and Belgium. Germans made one last attempt at a counterattack, the so-called Battle of the Bulge, because they threw their last reserves into the center of the Allied lines, pushed them back a decent ways until finally being pushed back by American troops. And then as American and British troops were advancing from the west and Soviet troops from the east into Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th. And then 8 days later, Germany surrendered May 8th, 1945. One last postscript. We don't have time to talk about it, obviously. As troops advanced into Germany, they came upon extermination camps where 6 million Jews, depending on it's 5 or 6 million, depending on your number you take, along with 6 million other people, were put to death. I won't go into too much detail. You've heard about this. Again, a lot of things went into this. Why? One thing I should mention again, Roosevelt's mostly one of the most successful presidents in U.S. history. One black mark is that Roosevelt administration had some warning about the camps as early as 1942, but they turned away Jews seeking to get out. A lot of other countries did too, not singling out the United States, but it's one of the things that actually did lead to that to a certain degree. But one of, of course, the most horrific outcomes of the war, and something, by the way, that's just it already happened. In World War I, you had the Armenian massacre. In between the wars, you probably never heard of this. There was a massive, more or less amounts to genocide in Ukraine. In the Ukraine, Joseph Stalin, for reasons I won't go into here, purposely caused a famine in Ukraine, killing somewhere between, low estimates are like 2 million people, high estimates about 7 million people. This is just an extension of that, unfortunately, but becomes known to the world because now you have the whole world seeing this, and film reels and images come out that are horrific. And it's one of the more lasting legacies, unfortunately, of the Second World War. There's an image of black pilots in Alabama who did serve and serve well and admirably in the war, despite segregation and discrimination. Famous picture of the U.S. troops hitting the beach at Normandy, and you can see. I'm assuming that's not fog, that's gunfire. So, but that's in this picture there. Just a couple of maps of the Allied movements. Again, in North Africa, the first big victories at El Alamein, but then they move across into cross and push Rommel. Urban Rommel is the leader of the Nazis in Africa. The Kasserine Pass is the big American victory under Patton. Whoa, go back. Wasn't done. Very sensitive this thing is. They made their way into Sicily, get up to Salerno, and then finally, again, you have British bombing flights going in there, air operations in the 1930s and 40s. Then you have, of course, I forgot to mention this: the Soviet Union, before they get turned on by the Germans, they invade Poland too as well. So you have those things going on there. Here you have the counterattack coming in 1944, 45, Norman invasion to Paris, then into Germany. At the bottom there, Austria, Soviets from the east through Lithuania, coming into Germany. And there, just one finally is a picture of people who survived the camps during the Holocaust. And finally, there's the war in the Pacific. If the Red Army was mostly, I think, deserves the lion's share of the credit for winning the war in Europe, the war in the Pacific is mostly an American war. The Brits also have interest there, but the Americans would put the bulk of their attention there. It's because they had interest there, economically speaking and otherwise. And Japan continued its conquest after Pearl Harbor, eventually threatening India, which is, again, that was part of Britain's empire at the point, in Australia. In May 1942, you have a turning point, a couple of battles. First, the Battle of the Coral Sea, where American naval forces halted the Japanese advance toward Australia. Then in June, later on, Americans inflicted very, very heavy damage on the Japanese fleet at Midway. That was the turning point. At that point, the Japanese slowly began to be pushed out. They didn't have the resources to keep moving forward. And over the next 18 months, Doug MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz led the offensive, hopping islands from Philippines, Iwo Jima to Okinawa. By early 1945, Japan was in sight, literally, despite their rather, they were very fierce fighters, kamikaze pilots and stuff like this. And it's these sorts of things that led American military strategists to think that Japan would fight to the death, to the last man. At the same time, you have Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meeting at Yalta in 1945, and trying to get an agreement about the peace to come. When Roosevelt died, he dies in May of 1945. Harry Truman becomes president, and he learns of the Manhattan Project. And so the way this goes is that the military planners of the United States didn't believe Japan would surrender unless their country was utterly destroyed. They calculated that a planned invasion of Japan will cost between 500,000 and 1 million Allied lives. And that led to the decision of Harry Truman to drop not one, but 2 atom bombs. The first on Hiroshima on August 6th, and then when the Japanese refused to surrender, a second one at the city of Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. 100,000 people died at Hiroshima and 60,000 at Nagasaki. Tens of thousands would die more slowly of radiation poisoning. Japan finally surrendered on August 10th and signed a formal treaty of surrender on September 2nd, 1945. A couple of last points about the dropping of the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Part of the reason why there's still a controversy about this is because it basically meant they knew they were going to kill civilians. And in fact, one of the things to note about that, and by the way, let me state things more clear. I am not saying the Allies and the Axis powers are morally equal. Hell no. But it's a fact that the Allies did at certain points do some really awful things. The British in 1945 intentionally bombed civilians in the city of Dresden in 1945 in Germany. Churchill did that, targeted them. Yeah, from what I understand, the United States did the same thing in Tokyo. The firebombing of Tokyo was, I think it killed more people than the 2 atom bombs. So you did have some, and again, this is a question I think you can debate to a certain degree, but it's at the very least morally questionable what they did. And I say that because the other thing I wanted to mention was American military planners didn't think the Japanese were going to surrender, partly because they were demanding unconditional surrender. The Japanese probably would have surrendered if you let them, if they made some concessions to them. Again, the reason they wouldn't make the concessions is because the Japanese started it. The Japanese had really treated American prisoners badly, places like Bataan. So there's all this stuff going on. But it could have been ended without that, I think. And again, that's why there's still a debate about this, if you're wondering. And just a couple of maps here to show you again. This is where Japanese control had gotten to by 1942. You see how far they've gotten from Japan, how much of China, how much of Asia is under their control. They really were trying to carve out an empire, and they were very close to Australia. Very close at this point. Burma was a British part of the British Empire, very close to India. So they were close to parts of the British Empire at that point. And then, of course, you see the island hopping of the 1940s, culminating in the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is just a picture of the Big Three at Yalta. Again, picture of it, Churchill on the left, FDR in the middle, who doesn't have but a few months to live, and this picture is going on, then Joseph Stalin on the right-hand side. And this is a picture of the city of Hiroshima, March 1946. More than, several months, I guess 6 months after, something like that. More than that, I'd say, after the dropping of the first atom bomb. So then we come to the end of the war and the emergence of a new order in the world, and what gets us toward the coming conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. There already were tensions before the war ended, obviously, between the Allies, between the Brits, the United States, and the Soviets. One of which was Stalin really wanted a bunch of Soviet-controlled satellite states to protect the Soviet Union's western border. The invasion by the Germans was traumatic. It was a really traumatic event for the Soviets. Roosevelt and Churchill more or less agreed in principle on the idea that the Soviets should have a sphere of, and by the way, sphere of influence means you get to dominate other countries around you. And make no mistake, by the way, I despise communism, and I hated the Soviet Union. But we do the same thing to our neighbors in Latin America, always have. We'll get to this during the Cold War. That's what that sphere of influence means. Roosevelt tried to get Stalin to give him a guarantee that self-determination and democratic elections would be held in Soviet-occupied territories like Poland and neighboring countries, but Soviet troops were already there. He basically sort of took Joseph Stalin's word that they would hold them at a future time, free elections at a future time. Churchill was much more skeptical, and he wanted to contain the Soviets to as small a sphere of influence as possible. But unfortunately, Roosevelt understood that British influence was coming to an end as a world power. This was the end. They were going to give up most of their territory soon after the war was over. And so he increasingly deferred to Stalin over Churchill in negotiations as the war ended. Churchill wanted the Western Allies to go all the way to Berlin, to Vienna, to Prague before the Soviets got there and to enter the Balkans, but Roosevelt checked him on all points. And it's hard to remember at the time, but in 1944, American opinion was very, very highly favorable to the Soviets. Again, they'd helped us defeat Hitler. And not just popular opinion, but there's a lot of intellectual and elite opinion looked favorably upon the Soviets. There were a lot of Soviet sympathizers in Roosevelt's cabinet. A few people were probably working for the Soviets, actually. But not just the Democrats. Wendell Willkie, who was a Republican candidate for president in 1940, went on a tour of the USSR and came back and wrote a book gushing about the virtues of the Soviet Union. Almost all these people, by the way, within a few years become, ardent anti-communists. But FDR at the time, his thinking was America is situated between, on the one hand, the antiquated British Empire, on the other hand, the Soviets, who, if they're communists and they're atheists, they're at least an egalitarian society like ours. That's kind of what he was thinking. And this is kind of what's happening, is that effectively the United States is going to take up the security, if you like, positions of the old British Empire once occupied. And Churchill kind of made this worse, because Churchill was a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist. He didn't want the British to give up any territory. He did everything he could to try to let the United States keep their empire in being. But it didn't work anyway. And in fact, in practice, even before the war was over, in 1944, 1945, for example, a communist uprising occurred in Greece. Churchill sent British troops in to put down that uprising over a protest of Roosevelt. 2 years later, we'll talk about this next time as well, the British, there was another communist uprising. The British refused to do anything about it because they didn't have the money for it anymore, didn't want to. At that point, the president, Harry Truman, goes to Congress, gets authorization not only to defend Greece, but Turkey from the communists. And in other words, all of a sudden, you can have things like, we'll get to the Marshall Plan and NATO. NATO is still a thing, of course. NATO is still with us, and it was still an issue with regards to this war in the Ukraine, Russia objecting to the expansion of NATO to its borders. But all this happens because even though the Americans were suspicious of Churchill and his imperialism, once they drop all that, they take up some of the same positions as they did. And and I should point this out again. You can say I'm going to have a lot of criticisms to make of American foreign policy in my lectures, but one thing to keep in mind after the war is that if the American government had pushed hard enough in 1945, it could have been a lot more of an aggressive power than it actually was. Because at the end of the war, the United States of America is probably as powerful as any country's ever been, relative to the rest of the world. We'll get to this in a second, but at the end of the war, the United States is the only advanced economy left standing, basically. It has no competitors. Between 1945 and 1949, it's the only power in the world that possesses nuclear weapons. The Soviets will steal the technology in a few years. But of course, they didn't have to. Historians like Neil Ferguson and John Lukács pointed out that they didn't need to. They were okay with letting the Soviets carve up Europe into their sphere of influence. because they'd given such American predominance in Western and Southern Europe and large parts of Asia. And as you're going to see, you're going to have a coming conflict between those two powers, but they didn't quite see it at that point. But what's going to happen is you're going to have the massive expansion of the American military apparatus as a result of this Cold War, which again, it took a while for people to recognize what was coming, but it was almost sort of natural that they took up the earlier positions of the British. As for the end of the war itself, Germany was to be divided into 4 zones controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin was partitioned among the 4. It'll eventually become, West Germany, East Germany. We'll get to that next time. The Big Four pushed for the establishment of the United Nations, which its Security Council would include 5 major allied powers, plus 6 other nations on a rotating basis. And the permanent members of the Security Council have a veto over power over decisions of the General Assembly, which, again, go back to contemporary events. If you're wondering why the United Nations hasn't condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they have a permanent veto, so they can prevent any sort of condemnation from happening. Whoops, not quite done. I don't know why that keeps happening. Apologies for that. And eventually, the United Nations does convene in 1945. A few days, April 1945. I want to say, I got Roosevelt's death date. Roosevelt died April 12th. The United Nations convenes in San Francisco, in April 25th, 1945. And a new era begins, the post-war era, the American era, in a lot of ways, a lot of respects. And you just kind of see here the figures, the death toll from World War II. Again, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of this. Actually, the Soviet Union and the Chinese much worse than anybody else. And if you notice, by the way, the Polish, why their casualties were so much worse than other countries, that's because they were occupied by the Germans. That's where, by the way, the majority of the Jewish people who died in the Holocaust came from. There were things like 3 million Jews in Poland before the Holocaust. They were almost all killed. So that's the reason for the numbers there. But you can see just how, this is, my math isn't great here, but this is nearly 50 million people. But also notice, by the way, how few people among the Allied victors actually died, especially the United States. Didn't affect us, so we were less affected overall. It means that, to finally close this lecture, we come out of this, as I mentioned before, in a totally new world. The United States is, we'll get to next time, a colossus, which has, for the time being, no equal. It means that, Germany, Japan in ruins, Britain's empire will be dissolved soon after, then a decade or so of the war. The colonial peoples of the world listened when FDR insisted that World War II was a war for democracy, again, just like Woodrow Wilson. And in the coming decades, you're going to have most of the former colonies in Asia and Africa begin their independence. And the war changes America really forever as well. It's easy to say that sometimes, but by 1950, 1/3 of every American male over the age of 19 was a war veteran of some kind. The greatest mobilization in the nation's history, only rivaled by the Civil War. That changes you when so many people go off to war like that. Even if they didn't fight, it just changes lives. And as you're going to see, this will continue into the Cold War in some respects, and it will lead to the transformation of the United States in unexpected ways. But it also puts America on the world stage in a way really no country ever had before. That is the lecture. Thank you guys for listening. Hope it was helpful to you. See you guys in discussion next time, talking about the readings from Major Problems. Take care, you guys.